Well, thank you for inviting me to present today. Thank you for the introduction. As Joanna said, my name is Heath White. I'm the Director of Evidence and Methods at the Australian Living Evidence Collaboration. It used to be consortium, but we've changed to collaboration more recently. And I'm based at Monash University at Melbourne, here in Melbourne in Australia. So I'm here to talk to you just about how living evidence is rapidly changing the guidelines landscape. So I'm sure you've all heard about living evidence. You've probably all participated in some way in some living evidence project, but I'll just talk to you in more depth about the process. So about us, so as I mentioned, we are ALIC. We are based kind of an offshoot originally of Cochrane, Australia, and based at Monash University here in Melbourne. We are essentially a central hub for living guidelines within Australia. So one of our main remits is to kind of develop methodology, evolve methods in living evidence. We're also very keen to support the development of living guidelines within Australia as well. So we do have some guidelines we develop in-house. We're very strongly invested at the moment in the living pregnancy and postnatal guidelines under our LEAP banner. We also do the living diabetes guidelines within Australia. And back in March 2020, we established the National Clinical Evidence Task Force to develop living guidelines in COVID-19 and MPX, or monkeypox. And they're since kind of wound up since then. But as I mentioned, we do work quite closely with a lot of groups within Australia, in particular Cancer Council Australia, Stroke Foundation, Kidney Health, etc., to help support their living guidelines in areas such as stroke, cancer, kidney and musculoskeletal conditions as well. We do have a broader group of societies that work with us. So we have 64 national peak bodies and networks that actually contribute to our work. Many of these joined within the COVID task force to help us develop those guidelines. Many have subsequently joined as part of the LEAP guidelines for our living pregnancy and postnatal guidelines. But obviously our kind of consideration is that we'd like to involve as many people as possible in developing the guidelines, so we don't have to worry about getting too much external kind of endorsement afterwards. Everybody's part of the team to start with. So they've been fantastic at working with us. So what is a living guideline? I'm sure most of you kind of know what a living guideline is. I have put a few definitions up here. The top one here is about the goal of living guidelines is keeping recommendations and guidelines up to date as new evidence becomes available. This, of course, is accurate, but it's relatively simplistic. So there is another definition that Ellie Ackle gave in the 2017 series of living guidelines papers. So these were developed originally about 7.5 years ago with a bunch of people from our team as well in Cochrane, Australia. And he says that a living guidelines and optimization of the guideline development process to allow updating of individual recommendations as soon as new relevant evidence becomes available. Again, very accurate. We have kind of evolved it slightly since then. So you can see here in our Australian Living Guidelines Handbook definition, which we published in late 2022, we've said that a living guideline is an evidence-based guideline that comprises one or more living recommendations that are continually updated as new information becomes available. So we're focusing more on the recommendation as the living unit and not just clinical evidence, but also other information as well. So clinical evidence is obviously extremely important in living guidelines, but it's not just the type of evidence you want to look at. You want to look at other information as well. So why do we bother with living guidelines? There are quite a few problems with traditional guidelines. So one of the main issues is the high initial resource requirement. So it can cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and take a few years to develop a complex clinical guideline. And then, of course, by the time you've defined the scope, developed the underlying evidence base, the guideline itself, had it approved and disseminated and published, it's essentially out there in the ether for 5, 6, 7 years before it's updated again. So during that period, it reduces the clinical currency quite substantially over time. There was one paper we were looking at that actually looked at chronic disease guidelines in areas like diabetes and cardiovascular disease and determined that about 1 in 5 recommendations are outdated after 3 years. So if your guidelines are out there for 5, 6, 7 years before you update it, there's a lot of recommendations or treatment decisions being made on outdated clinical recommendations. It can't adapt to changes in policy and practice, can't adapt to new products in market, etc. And then updating the entire guideline can also be wasteful as well, because many of those recommendations won't change. So we have a more targeted approach. If you use living guidelines, you still need to climb the mountain. So you still need that original baseline guideline, whether you develop it de novo or whether you adopt or adapt an existing one from another source, it's up to you. But then once you've climbed the mountain, we do what we call walking across the plateau. So we do smaller changes far more frequently. And of course, this is a low but consistent expense, but it maintains high currency. So if there are any new products in market, any changes to policy or practice, any information that you didn't include in the original version of the guideline, you can capture those very quickly and update it very quickly. And it can evolve through feedback mechanisms. So obviously with traditional guidelines, you want it to be as perfect as possible once you publish, because once it's out there, it's very difficult to change a traditional guideline. But with living guidelines, you want as much feedback as you can, because the more feedback you receive, the better you can optimize your recommendations and continually improve them as you go along. So not every guideline is suitable for a living evidence approach. So we have three key criteria we often apply. The first is whether the question is considered to be a high priority. So obviously people need to want to know the answer to this question, otherwise it's just not worth doing, obviously. Is there any uncertainty in the strength or direction of the recommendation? So there needs to be a little bit of uncertainty with regards to whether a treatment works or not, or what the best approach is to a treatment, for instance. And is there a likelihood of new relevant evidence being published in the near future? Because obviously, if you have a high priority guideline where there is uncertainty, a high priority recommendation where there still is uncertainty in the strength or direction of recommendation, if you scope ahead and find out there's no research being conducted within this space, there's not much point having it living, because essentially you're going to find nothing. You're going to spend all this energy searching and screening, and you're going to not find anything. So this is the living diabetes guidelines. We thought, well, we'll apply this to the diabetes guidelines and see if it fits, and of course it does. So we have the Australian National Diabetes Strategy, which calls for the development of Australian government-approved guidelines for diabetes. There was significant uncertainty. So the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is the Australian body that approves guidelines within Australia, there were no NHMRC-approved guidelines for diabetes treatment or management. So they do get approved, but then after 5 years, they fall off the approval list. So we relied heavily on the American Diabetes Association and Diabetes Canada guidelines, and there was significant uncertainty around a lot of treatments like hybrid closed-loop systems and therapeutics for type 2 diabetes after metformin. And there was a lot of evidence being developed within this space. So there was a high likelihood of new relevant evidence being published. So this fit the bill. And if you apply that to all living guidelines, then you're sure to kind of determine whether yours is suitable for it. There are a few different approaches to developing a living guideline. So the first approach here is you can develop a traditional guideline from scratch or adapt an existing guideline, and then you can choose to maintain all the recommendations as living. And this is what the Stroke Foundation did in Australia here. In 2017, they updated their most recent guideline, and then they decided to make all of the recommendations, all 150 plus recommendations living moving forward for the next 5 years. So they were funded to do the world's first living guideline. You could develop a traditional guideline from scratch or adapt an existing guideline like Stroke did, but rather than maintain all the recommendations, you can have a panel or a group of experts that select specific recommendations within that guideline to maintain. So not all of them need to be living, and I'll touch on that more as we go along. You could do what we did for diabetes, and this is we identified key priority topics that met the criteria for a living approach, and then developed baseline recommendations and maintained those. So we had our panel of experts and all of our stakeholders get together and just determine what are the most important parts of diabetes treatment and management that they'd like to look at. They come up with technology for type 1 diabetes and therapeutics for type 2 diabetes. And so we developed recommendations around those two areas and then kind of maintain those as living. And we've since expanded to in-hospital glycemic management as well. Or you could do what we did for COVID-19. This is very much an outlier. And for this, we kind of defined the scope parameters and then responded to relevant evidence as and when it became available. Obviously, we didn't know what people were going to use to try and treat COVID-19, so we couldn't have that standard approach of we're looking at this exact population with this intervention and this comparator, because we weren't sure what the interventions were going to be. So we had a core outcome set, and then we actually developed PICOs iteratively as we found new studies within this space. So this is kind of the living guideline cycle. So the first step, you obviously need that baseline guideline, but then you have to review the scope and the methods. And then once you have finalized the updated scope, then you can update the search, synthesis recommendations, update the supporting information, and then finally publish and disseminate the updated guidelines. And then you just continually go through this cycle. So I'll touch on each of these briefly. The first is to review the scope and methods. So you need to ask yourself, are you still asking the right questions? So obviously it's not just individual recommendations themselves, but it's the entire paradigm or the context in which treatment's given that can evolve as well. So at the guideline level, you want to ask yourself, are there any new clinical questions that should be addressed? This could be from feedback from others, or it could be from your guideline development groups, for instance. Do your methods need to be adjusted? So you can shift your methods as well. We have done this for the COVID task force, and again, I'll touch on that later. Has there been a shift in priorities from key stakeholders as well? And then at the recommendation level, you can ask yourself questions like, are adjustments needed to the inclusion criteria or the scope of a particular question? So therapeutics for type 2 diabetes is a good example here. Originally, when we started our work back in 2018, it was a strong focus on SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 receptor agonists. But since then, we've had a few new therapeutics like tirzepatide and finerenone pop up on the radar, and they've become very important. So obviously you need to actually adjust your criteria and your scope to match the kind of change in treatment paradigms that are coming along. So are there any new or alternative viewpoints that should be captured? So maybe consumer panel input or special populations like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Is the recommendation missing any important information? So it could be any old information like dosage information, or does the analysis approach need updating? So once you've asked yourself all of these questions and you're ready to get going, then you can go straight into the search. So first thing, obviously make any adjustments to the search strings to capture any of those updates that I just discussed, or any addition of any new clinical questions. You can consider consolidating all the search strings into a single search. So a lot of people do this already. You can obviously, if you're doing a guideline, you can have a single search and then just triage all of the citations into their respective buckets, I suppose you could say. But a lot of people, let's say you've got 10 living guidelines, you might have 10 PICO questions with 10 defined search strings for each of those. So you kind of separate them out. It's much easier if you do combine them all into a single search and then use a software like Covenants to triage them into their respective reviews. It's also very useful to schedule automatic RSS feeds. So for us, our search specialist, Steve McDonald, has set up an automatic RSS feed. So the metadata and PubMed's update on the first of each month. So on the second, we do an automatic search, sends us an email just pinging us, letting us know how we found this many citations, so we can add those to Covenants and get to screening. And there's also flexibility in the frequency of searching and screening. So let's say these asterisks represent quarterly updates. You could do your automatic search in January where you find, say, 200 citations. Again, in Feb, you find another 200, and another 200 in March. So 600 citations all up. You have the option of, I suppose, just putting these all into a single pool, and then when you're ready for your scheduled update, screening all 600, seeing if you find any interesting studies. Or you could screen these citations as and when you do the searches on a monthly basis. We do like doing the latter because if you do the searches on a monthly basis and screen on a monthly basis, if you do find an impactful study, so you find a study that thinks, wow, this is amazing, this is definitely going to change a recommendation, or there's a good chance this is going to change a recommendation, it can trigger an update early. So you don't have to wait for that 3-month update period. You can update it sooner because you know it's going to change a recommendation, or you're confident it will change a recommendation. So once you've done the search as well, there are also thresholds for updating. So not every study needs to be incorporated into the evidence base straight away. And the question we ask ourselves is there a chance that the new evidence will affect the recommendation? So if you think there is a chance, then obviously you'll extract all the data, do the risk of bias assessment, update the evidence base, get the panel together, revise the recommendation if you need to, etc., and just go through the full gamut of updating the living guideline. If you think it won't, so let's say you have a recommendation based on 3 studies with 10,000 participants that says treatment A is better than treatment B, and you find another study with 50 participants that kind of supports your recommendation already, you think it's definitely not going to change anything. We don't need to go through all the effort of actually including in the evidence base, getting the panel together to confirm it doesn't change anything. So instead, you can just add it to a surveillance list for future analysis. But it's also very important that you actually make people aware of this. So if you do the search, you can include a statement in the guideline just saying, hey, look, we found one study with 24 participants comparing A with B. It was determined that inclusion of data from the study will have no impact on the strength or direction of the recommendation or supporting information. So as a result, we've parked it in the surveillance pile and will include it when further evidence becomes available in the future. Now, when we do the synthesis, we do use high throughput technology enablers. So without these software systems, it would be very difficult to maintain high throughput or fast moving living guidelines. So obviously many of you would have used these before. So obviously we do our searches, import those results into Covenants where we do the screening, and you can do data extraction as well in Covenants. Send that data to Cochrane RevMath for statistical analysis, and then through to Magic App where we actually develop the evidence profile and the recommendations and finally publish. And so this is the tech cycle that we go through generally. Again, I'll touch on each of these, but you're probably familiar with most of them. So Covenants, obviously you can import results from EndNote, or you can import RIS files from different search databases. You can screen the titles and abstracts in full text. And it's definitely my favorite software when it comes to actually screening citations. They have a fantastic mobile application. So there's been many occasions I've been sitting there just waiting for the kids at the school gate, just doing some screening while I sit there on my phone. You can extract study characteristics, outcome data, and do risk of bias assessments within Covenants as well. They have actually improved this offering substantially lately. So if the last extraction you did in Covenants was 5 years ago, I recommend you hop in and have a go now because it has improved substantially since then. You can export the results directly to Cochrane RevMan Web. And one thing I thought I'd touch on here as well is Covenants have implemented and are implementing new Cochrane RCT and PICO or PICS filters that automatically remove irrelevant citations. So essentially, and I think it's about 25% removal and about 99% accuracy. So if you have 1,000 citations within your search, you import them into Covenants, it will remove 250 of those automatically at 99% accuracy, and it will put them in a separate bucket. So you can still look at them if you want to, but it would save a lot of work using that. Cochrane RevMan, being Cochrane, I'm sure most of you have used this, if not all of you. Obviously, it automatically pulls data for relevant outcomes, provides various analysis methods. You can graphically present your forest plots and also the very Cochrane-specific risk of bias analyses. You always see those little green, yellow, and red spheres that are very Cochrane-esque. You can test for heterogeneity, statistical significance, do subgroup analyses, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the good parts about this as well is that you can export it directly to MagicApp. So you can't export it that easily from RevMan Web. So if you're using RevMan 5.4, which is obviously no longer supported, that's easily importable to MagicApp. There are some issues with regards to RevMan Web and MagicApp, but they're working on resolving those. And then you've got MagicApp, and I do apologize every time I give a presentation like this. I say the classic, MagicApp is where the magic happens, because it is essentially true. You can see at the top right, we have our evidence profile. So this is kind of MagicApp's summary of findings table. You have your outcome, you have your importance of your outcome, so critical, important, or not important, number of studies, number of participants, absolute effect estimates with the difference, certainty of evidence based on grade, and then of course a plain text summary. So here we have a conditional recommendation looking at metformin as first-line monotherapy. So you can see you've got the recommendation, the supporting information or additional information underneath it. And then down the bottom, you have your ribbon where you have your research evidence. So you can link your recommendation directly to the evidence profile itself to see what evidence you use to actually develop the recommendation. Evidence to decision, obviously, this is also very important. So it's not just the clinical evidence that informs the recommendation. You're also looking at patient preference and values, acceptability, feasibility, etc. And then the rationale is essentially the justification as to why you came up with this recommendation based on a combination of the evidence and the ETD. And one of the things I really like about MagicApp is this feedback option here. So obviously MagicApp is accessible 24/7 to anybody around the world. They can jump in, have a look at the guidelines, and they have these feedback buttons. So anybody can leave feedback whenever they like. And this is very useful for helping evolve the guideline as you move forward. Now, there are also quite a few shades of grey in living recommendations. So they're not all created equal. You can update all of them and you can just say, look, they're all on an equal footing. But for diabetes and COVID-19, we implemented slightly different priority systems for them. So for diabetes, let's say you've got a high priority recommendation with a rapidly evolving evidence base, something you really want to stay on top of quite quickly, like flash glucose monitoring or hybrid closed loop systems. We want to make sure we update these every 3 months, so we make sure we're on top of the evidence as and when it comes through. For high priority topics where there's a potential for new evidence, but maybe not quite as likely as the other high priority recommendations, such as continuous glucose monitoring, you might only need to update every 6 months. And then for other topics that might be higher, moderate priority, but with a relatively stable evidence base like metformin, for instance, we've got dozens of studies with over 100,000 participants showing it's the best first-line treatment. There's not a great deal of uncertainty there, so it's still living, but we only update it every 12 or so months, for instance. For COVID-19, we had a slightly different priority system. So for treatments, for instance, that were being used to treat COVID-19, or there was a lot of media around them, such as ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, I'm sure you all remember the kerfuffle around those two therapeutics. We update these immediately the moment we find any new evidence. So these were high priority. If anything's published, any RCTs are published with information regarding any of these treatments, we'll update it straight away. For other ones, such as dexamethasone and Ronapreve, these were used to treat patients with COVID-19, but had a relatively stable evidence base. We'd review the new evidence and would update the recommendation if it might change the recommendation, or update the evidence profile if it might change the recommendation. But if not, we'd add it to the surveillance list. And then we had a bunch of low priority recommendations where we'd just add it to the surveillance list and we wouldn't update the recommendation because these are generally kind of smaller treatments that didn't work, like triazovir and bromhexine hydrochloride. But these aren't fixed. So let's say you find a bromhexine hydrochloride study that shows, it's got 2,000 participants showing it works to treat patients with mild COVID. You might bump that up to the high priority section. So this is very flexible and dynamic. and you can adjust the priority based on external triggers. Now, with traditional guidelines, usually you've got the panel, they come together, look at the evidence, come up with the recommendations, and work through this process with you until publication. But then once it's published, they essentially fall off, the team disbands, and everybody goes their own ways. They might come back together in 4, 5, 6, 7 years, or however long until you update the guideline, but that's essentially their involvement done. With living guidelines, let's say you're doing a living guideline for 5 years, you'll need like a living guideline development panel to be around for that 5-year period to be available to review the new evidence if you find it. But if you're doing quarterly updates, for instance, it doesn't mean you have to get the panel together every 3 months. So if you find no new evidence, or if you find no impactful evidence, you might just email the panel saying, hey, look, we've done a search, we found nothing, or we found 2 new studies that don't change anything. Are you happy with this? Yes, thank you. And then if you do find impactful evidence, then you'll convene the panel to discuss the potential impact the evidence has on the recommendation and actually get the group together. So that might only be every 9 or 12 months, for instance. But it is very useful to, obviously keep engaged with your panel. So to email them every 3 months, just to let them know what you're finding and how you're going. And also just confirm that they still want to participate in the group, update conflicts of interest and affiliations, because obviously they shift over time as well. So you need to have living COI policies and living COI summaries as well. So just keep them involved. Now, it's not all about the clinical evidence as well. So obviously clinical evidence is extremely important, but there are many non-clinical evidence-based changes that might result in massive changes to the guideline itself. So this is an example from the COVID-19 guidelines. This is casirivimab plus imdevimab, or Ronapreve. I'll just say Ronapreve from now on just because it's shorter. So early on, we actually had a single study with 2 different parts that had 1,300 participants that showed that Ronapreve was effective in treating patients with mild COVID-19 with risk factors for disease progression. So based on the clinical evidence, we came up with a conditional recommendation supporting the use of Ronapreve to treat patients with mild COVID-19. Since then, there was an in vitro study published that showed that there was significantly reduced activity of Ronapreve against newer variants of COVID-19. So we just put a statement in that additional information saying, hey, we've found this new kind of information. We're just going to keep an eye on it. We're not worried yet. But then, of course, a few months pass, and there are multiple additional in vitro studies confirming that there is significant reduced activity of Ronapreve against Omicron and new Omicron subvariants. And so we just put some text in saying, we're starting to get worried here, essentially. If there are any other treatments suitable or available, please use them. If not, use Ronapreve, but try and use something else if you have it available. And it wasn't long after that, our colleagues at the Doherty Institute, we had a meeting with them and looked at all the in vitro evidence, and we thought, no, it doesn't work. So we convened the panel, and they wanted to change the recommendation from conditional use to consensus against, based on this in vitro evidence. There's also other changes. So initially, when we supported the use of Ronapreve, because it looked like it worked, it wasn't feasible. So we had this big red mark against feasibility because you could not get it in Australia. It was not available within Australia at all. So even though it would be great to use it, good luck getting your hands on it. But then it wasn't long after that that the Australian government, so the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, approved it under the Black Triangle scheme, and we actually had some supply within Australia. Of course, the issue there was we didn't have much and it was quite expensive. So this obviously had impacts on equity and resource use as well within the evidence to decision. And finally, we had our clinical recommendation, but then we had a dedicated consumer panel as well involved with the COVID guidelines. So after we published the first recommendation, we got the consumer panel together and thought, hey, what do you guys think? And then they come up with their values and preference statement. So you can see here that even though the clinical evidence base was established very early on for this treatment, we had significant changes to equity and resources based on cost and access, feasibility based on Therapeutic Goods Administration approval and supply, changes to preference and values based on consumer input, and then the recommendation itself and supporting information changed substantially, all based on in vitro, i.e. non-clinical evidence, to a consensus against. So there is substantial scope for the use of non-clinical evidence-based updates to living recommendations. As I mentioned earlier, if you have new products in market, if there are any changes in policy regarding approval, availability, or reimbursement of a particular drug, for instance, variation in practice is also quite important. So obviously, a lot of people might have fantastic machines available within metropolitan settings, but good luck getting people in remote settings into the hospital to use those. And also here in Australia as well, in particular, you have various populations that you might need to revise recommendations to actually be specific for, like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So essentially, there's a lot of scope to use non-clinical evidence-based information to update your recommendations to make sure they're fit for purpose in whatever context you're delivering care. So there's also publication and dissemination. So we use MagicApp. So obviously MagicApp, as I discussed before, is this whole process where you can generate the evidence profiles within the system, the supporting information, make your recommendations there. So this is what we present to the panels. But it's also a very useful publishing platform. So this is what we've used for the COVID guidelines. And in fact, this is what we use for all of our guidelines for the most part. It's good at maintaining a chronology of updates at the time of publication. So once you have all your recommendations set within the system and you're ready to publish, before you hit that publish button, you can actually include some text just saying, you know, hey, we found X, Y, and Z studies, or we've updated this and this recommendation, and add whatever information you'd like to add in there just to kind of maintain track of where you're at with your living guideline. And this was very useful within the COVID task force because we updated our guideline 135 times in just over 3 years. So very useful for keeping track of all the changes. Some journals do promote the publication of living guidelines, but the systems are definitely not developed to respond rapidly to updates. So even by the time you've actually updated your guideline and it's gone through the system, and if it does require specific peer review, or even if the editors review it themselves, it can be a few weeks before the journal itself actually publishes your update. So it can be quite slow. And then, of course, once you publish, you disseminate through your normal channels. So you might have your email list, you might have social media, newsletters, etc. And again, with traditional guidelines, you want to get the guideline as accurate as you possibly. You want it to be as perfect as it possibly can be before you publish, because once you publish, it's out in the ether for several years before you're ready for the next update. With living guidelines, obviously, you want the recommendations to be as good as possible before you publish, but they don't need to be perfect. So you want to ask everybody, are we missing any important clinical questions in our guideline? Are there any other gaps we can address? What can we do to make these guidelines more useful or more implementable, for instance? Did we capture all the important information in the new recommendations? What do you want to see in this guideline? And it's really useful getting all this feedback, because once you have all this feedback, then you go to the next cycle. So this is where you incorporate all the feedback you've received from all your stakeholders to improve the guideline so they can go around for the next cycle. So it's not just, so that's kind of the living guideline cycle, but overlapping cycles are very important as well. So this is just an example of the task force, the COVID task force. This is the drug treatment recommendation cycle. So in week one, it was a 3-week cycle. In week one, we'd do daily searching. So Steve McDonald, our fantastic search specialist, would do daily searching, and then we'd screen the citations. And if we found anything relevant, then we do our data analyses, data extraction, I should say risk of bias, and develop our evidence profiles within Magic. And then on the Friday, we'd send the agenda to the drug treatment panel in preparation for the meeting the next week. In week 2, the drug treatment panel would meet on the Tuesday. We'd usually draft the recommendations within the meeting, but then we'd have a couple of days afterwards to finalize the recommendations if we needed that additional time. And then we'd send those recommendations to the guideline leadership group on Friday, the second week. Then in week 3, the guideline leadership group would meet on the Monday, ratify the recommendations. We'd send them to the steering committee, then meet on the Wednesday and ratify the recommendations, and then we'd have final approval and publication of the update on Thursday or Friday of week 3. It didn't always work quite as smoothly. Obviously, sometimes the guideline leadership group or steering committee wanted some changes to the recommendations, so it might bounce back and forth between the panels and the different committees. But generally, it went really well. And as you can see here, if we found, for instance, a study on Friday of week 1 and went through the entire process and published on Thursday of week 3, it could be as little as 13 days from publication of the primary study to publication of the update within Magic of our guidelines. But obviously, we didn't just do this as a 3-week cycle, because this would be 3 weekly updates, whereas we did weekly updates within the task force. So these overlapping cycles are very useful if you kind of manage these well and if you're organized. So obviously with the first cycle, we do the daily searching, screening, etc., and look at all the data there, and then send it to the drug treatment panel on the Friday for their meeting in week 2. And then when week 2 came around, whilst we're meeting with the drug treatment panel, developing those recommendations, finalizing them, and then sending them to the guideline leadership group, we'd be going into week 1 of the second round of the subsequent recommendations we're going to be developing. So we'll still be doing the searching, screening, etc., in the background for the next round of recommendations or next round of drug treatments. And then obviously we'd go to the first cycle, week 3. So while the guideline leadership group is ratifying the recommendations and the steering committee is looking at them, And as we're publishing the final recommendations for that first cycle, the second cycle would be going through the drug treatment panel and being sent to guideline leadership group. And then the third cycle would be undergoing their first week of the process, which is the daily searching, screening, etc. So this is just like a revolving, continuing, overlapping cycle as we went along. But obviously, each of these cycles only represents the first stage of the recommendation development. So this is primarily clinical evidence. If we find the study saying, this recommendation looks, or this treatment looks particularly useful, then we'd want to get it through quite quickly, develop the recommendation supporting its use. And then, of course, we'd kind of have stage 2, which is the post-publication stakeholder consultation, consumer panel feedback, where we can update the supporting information within the recommendation. So again, it's this whole, you publish your first recommendation, but then it's not fixed because then you incorporate all this additional information and update your recommendation in subsequent iterations as needed. So this is living methodology. I kind of touched on this briefly earlier. This is a paper we published quite recently in the Guidelines International Network journal. And this is just kind of our changes in methodology as well. So just like a living guideline is living, and living recommendations are also living, we also have living methodology within this system. So for phase 1, so when we started with the COVID task force, there was very little direct evidence available. It was a highly novel condition, obviously, so nobody had any RCTs looking at treatments for COVID-19. It didn't exist at that stage. So we looked at existing guidelines and just indirect evidence, and we based our initial recommendations just on the initial consensus recommendations based on these existing guidelines with primarily indirect evidence. As the evidence started coming through, we adjusted our methods and we thought, well, look, we want to fill the gaps. So we started looking at direct evidence, direct clinical evidence, to plug the holes within the recommendations we developed from these existing guidelines. And then phase 3 was when the massive push went through with all the research. So obviously, it's probably the most researched topic in such a short space in history for COVID-19 treatments. It took probably about 9 months from the inception of the task force in March for there to be a big push on research that was coming through. But the minute all these publications started coming out, looking at different treatments to treat COVID-19, we wanted to look at all the RCT evidence. So any RCT that was published for any treatment to treat COVID-19, no matter how small, would grab it straight away, would analyze the data, would develop a recommendation for it. So we had primarily a whole bunch of only in research recommendations. I think we have about 48 treatments that are only in research at this stage because they were quite small. And we started developing our first strong conditional recommendations as well here. As time went on, we went to phase 4, so we adjusted our methods again. So because we had quite a good idea about what worked and what didn't work and where to focus our efforts, there was still a large body of research being published, but we thought, this pile of research probably won't go anywhere, so we'll make it low priority and we'll add that to the surveillance list. This is where kind of all the good stuff's happening in this little area here, so we'll make these recommendations high priority. And so here's where we applied this prioritization that I showed earlier within the task force. So we wanted to really focus our efforts on things that we knew worked or would likely work, or there was a lot of kind of media around, and not so much on the other stuff. And then phase 5 came around, and obviously we had reduced funding. There was a significant limitation in the quality of evidence being published. So we're looking at things like the recovery trial and the principal trial and all those large trials. And we focus on these high impact evidence bases only, and the remainder were added to the surveillance list. So as you can see, we adjusted our methods throughout the whole process, just based on capacity, funding, and just the research space itself. There are other considerations. So funding is another big one. I often get asked, how do you get funded for living guidelines? And it was really difficult. I think there's 2 things that help in 2024, quite frankly. It's increased awareness of and acceptance of living guidelines. So back in December 2018, when I joined ALEC as working on the living diabetes guidelines, I felt there was a general consensus among potential funders in the government essentially saying, what are living guidelines and why should we care? What's the whole point of doing a living guideline? And so we had to convince funders that living guidelines had merit. Whereas we move forward to February this year, the government released a tender for dementia guidelines, and they actually specified that deliverables are likely to include the applicant providing advice about the potential future conversion of the guidelines to living guidelines, including the extent to which dementia meets the criteria to warrant living guidelines, according to ALEC, and also the cost and time implications. So we went from, in just 6 years, or less than 6 years, just over 5 years, funders and government saying, what's a living guideline and why should I care? To them actually really understanding what living guidelines were. And this was mainly based, I suppose, on partly kind of the success of the living diabetes guidelines, a lot to do with the living stroke guidelines. So as I said, they were the first large-scale living guideline, and they did a really good job. So the government really stood up and paid attention to them. And of course, also the COVID task force. I think that's where living guidelines really came to the fore in Australia, and we really started to get noticed. The second is optimizing the processes to maximize your impact. So you could go to the government and say, look, we want to maintain every recommendation as a living. We want to kind of look at everything, and it's going to cost quite a bit of money. So if you do the all or nothing approach, and in this case, it's the all approach, let's say you have 100 recommendations. You want to make all of them living. You don't want to define any priority, so they're all on an equal footing. And you want to incorporate new evidence the minute you find it. So, for instance, if you do quarterly updates, you might find 500 citations a quarter. There might be 10 to 12 updates. Most of them are probably low to no impact, though, and it's going to cost quite a bit because obviously it's a lot of work maintaining 100 living recommendations. Whereas if you can go to the funders and say, look, we've got a guideline with 100 recommendations, 20 meet the criteria for living, so we want to maintain a close watch on the evidence as it evolves for these 20 recommendations. The other 80 are quite stable. So, you can still update those, obviously. You can still make them kind of living, but maybe only every 12 or 24 months, for instance. You could prioritize those recommendations. So you have 8 high priority recommendations and the other 12 maybe moderate or low priority. And then you can apply your update threshold as well, so that only those studies that you think might change something are incorporated straight away into the evidence base. So you go from 500 citations with multiple low impact updates that cost a lot of money because of the work you're putting in, to maybe 200 citations a quarter, maybe 2 or 3 updates, all going to be moderate or high impact because these are all going to be updates to your high priority clinical questions, and it's going to cost a lot less because obviously you're doing a lot less work. So living guidelines, they're achievable, and I actually think they're quite fun. I know a lot of people would like to laugh at me when I say they're fun, but I stand by my word. I think they are fun. So obviously they maximize the currency of the recommendations and supporting information based on clinical, but also non-clinical evidence. And so it's quite useful, it's quite, I suppose part of the fun part is engaging with people after you publish your guidelines. So you've got your guideline out there, but then you want to talk to researchers, you want to talk to clinicians, you want to talk to consumers, other stakeholders, just to find out, what do you think of our guideline? How can we make this better? What should we look at next? And so that's always very rewarding doing that. It does appear quite intensive, but it can be easily achieved through good management. So as I showed with the COVID task force, we had those weekly updates to our guidelines. I sincerely hope never to have to do weekly updates to living guidelines again. It was quite intensive, but obviously if we can do kind of living updates for COVID guidelines in a fast-moving area such as COVID, then it's not too onerous to do quarterly updates as well. And then of course, if you do have your update, you can look at the 3-month mark, look at your citations as you're developing the evidence base, as you're kind of getting the panel together to develop those recommendations or update the recommendations. You can be searching for new studies while that's happening in the background for the next update. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't need to be perfect. And this is one of my favorite parts about living guidelines. You can improve them constantly. So as I said, you want to get them as perfect as possible, but everybody misses something. And so this enables the scope and individual recommendations themselves to evolve over time. So if you have somebody saying, I don't quite understand this, could you please clarify? You can just change some wording. It could be as little as changing some wording, or you could add some new kind of information in with regards to specific information for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for instance. So they get constantly better and better and better and better, moving towards perfection. Although, I don't think you can ever get to perfect, but you can get close. And it's never all or nothing. So as I mentioned, you can have your subgroup of recommendations that are living. You can apply different priorities to those recommendations. You can apply thresholds for incorporating new evidence. So it's not all or nothing. It's not a great deal of work to maintain your key recommendations. And it's finding that balance between the amount of work required to maintain living guidelines or living recommendations within a guideline, and which recommendations should be living, and kind of finding that sweet spot. And as I mentioned in the last slide as well, the increased awareness and acceptance of living guidelines has been fantastic. So within Australia, as I mentioned, the National Health and Medical Research Council, the group that approves guidelines for use within Australia, if you submit a traditional guideline to NHMRC, a lot of people don't actually do it because there's so many hurdles you need to jump. There's so much information you need to give them. There's a lot of kind of, methods critiquing and so forth. And so a lot of people don't actually submit to NHMRC because it is very onerous. But we've been working with Geraint Duggan and his team at NHMRC, and they've been absolutely fantastic working with us to kind of streamline the approval of living guidelines. So for instance, you still need to get your guideline approved, as the baseline guideline, but then when you submit subsequent living guideline iterations to an HMRC, it's much, much easier to get them approved. And so I will stop there and just say thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me as well. I recommend hopping on, checking out our website, livingevidence.org.au, and you can also hop onto Magic App and look at our guidelines as well if you like for pregnancy, postnatal, and COVID-19, and also the diabetes, stroke guidelines, rheumatology guidelines are all up there as well. And then please check out the Australian Living Guidelines Handbook. It was published in late 2022, so we're currently giving it an update. But you can find that on the website. And we have a series of methods for living guidelines published relatively recently in JClinEpi as well. So I'll leave it there. Yes, thank you.